Imagine, if you will, a single crystal. It sits in a porcelain bowl on a kitchen table. It is white, granular, and sharp-edged. It catches the morning light like a crushed diamond. To the naked eye, it is indistinguishable from salt or sand. It has no smell. It makes no sound. It is the most ordinary substance in the modern world. We find it in the paper packets at a diner. We find it dissolved in our morning coffee. It is baked into the crust of our bread and hidden inside the sauce of our dinner. It is so common, so cheap, and so abundant that we never stop to look at it. But if you were to look closer, if you could look past the geometry of that white crystal and into its history, you would see a story that is anything but pure. You would see the smoke of burning fields darkening the Caribbean sun. You would hear the cracking of iron whips and the grinding of massive stone gears. You would see the rise of the British Empire and the fall of kings. You would see the kidnapping of 12 million people forced across the Atlantic Ocean to feed a hunger that could never be satisfied. And finally, you would see the slow, silent biological shift of the human body as entire populations began to succumb to a disease that was once rare but is now an epidemic. This is the biography of a grass. It is the story of how a rare exotic spice became a daily necessity and how the pursuit of sweetness turned the world bitter. Close your eyes. Let us go back to the beginning, before the insulin spikes, before the industrial refineries, before the slave ships. Let us go back 8,000 years to the mud at the edge of the world. The story begins in the heat. In the deep prehistoric past, on the island of New Guinea, the air is thick with moisture. This is a land of extremes, violent volcanoes, dense rainforests, and relentless tropical rain. Here, in the low-lying marshlands, where the soil is black and volcanic, a giant grass begins to evolve. Its scientific name is Saccharum officinarum, which translates to the noble cane. It is a fitting name. The plant is aggressive and majestic. It grows in tall, dense clumps, shooting up 15 feet toward the canopy, fighting the jungle for sunlight. Its stalks are thick as a human wrist, segmented by hard knots like bamboo. But unlike bamboo, which is hollow and dry, this grass is solid. The plant has evolved a unique way to store energy. It drinks the heavy rains and absorbs the intense equatorial sun, converting solar energy into a chemical battery stored in its juice. That battery is pure sucrose. For thousands of years, the indigenous people of New Guinea, the Papuans, lived alongside this grass. To them, it was not an ingredient, it was a tool for survival. Imagine a hunter moving through the humid highlands of New Guinea thousands of years ago. The terrain is difficult, the mud is deep, the heat is oppressive. His energy is fading. He stops by a clump of tall purple grass. He takes his stone knife and hacks off a stalk. He peels back the hard, dirty bark to reveal the clean white fiber inside. He puts the raw fiber in his mouth and chews.
The sensation is instantaneous. A rush of pure liquid energy floods his system. It is sweet, grassy, and floral. It tastes of the earth and the rain. He chews until the flavor is gone, then spits the dry fiber onto the forest floor and continues his journey. For thousands of years, the grass stayed in the Pacific. It was trapped by the ocean. But the people of the Pacific were master navigators. They built outrider canoes, carving them from tree trunks, and set out across the vast blue expanse of the ocean. They carried with them the essentials of life: coconuts, dogs, chickens, and cuttings of the sugar cane. The cane traveled as a passenger. It was wrapped in damp moss and leaves to keep the buds alive. It moved slowly, island by island, century by century. It landed in the Philippines. It rooted in the volcanic soil of Indonesia. And eventually, it reached the coast of India.
It is in India, around the year 350 AD, that the history of the world shifts. The ancient Indians were not content to simply chew the raw stalk. They wanted to extract the essence. They wanted to separate the sweetness from the fiber. In the fertile valleys of the Ganges, farmers began to treat the cane as a raw material for industry. They developed heavy stone presses. Imagine two massive wheels of granite weighing tons arranged vertically. A wooden beam is attached to the stone, and the beam is yoked to a pair of slow-moving oxen. Day after day, under the hot sun, the oxen walk in circles. The stones grind against each other with a low, rumbling sound. The farmers feed the long stalks of cane between the stones. There is a crunching sound, and the juice begins to flow, a murky, greenish-brown liquid collecting in a clay pot. But cane juice is unstable. In the heat of India, it begins to ferment within hours. It turns sour, it turns to vinegar. You cannot store it, you cannot trade it. So they introduced fire. They poured the juice into wide, shallow copper pans and set them over wood fires. As the water evaporated, the liquid thickened. It bubbled and darkened, filling the air with the smell of caramel. And then, as it cooled, something miraculous happened. Tiny crystals began to form. The Indians called these crystals khanda. It is the word from which we get our English word candy. This was a technological breakthrough. By removing the water, they had turned a perishable fruit into a non-perishable stone. Sugar was no longer a snack, it was a spice. It could be stored in jars. It could be loaded onto wagons. It could be carried across deserts. When the armies of the Persian Empire invaded India, they found this strange crop. They tasted the crystals and were baffled. They wrote home describing a plant that produced honey without bees. Slowly, the secret moved west. It traveled along the Silk Road. It traveled in the saddlebags of merchants. But the cane is a thirsty plant. It requires massive amounts of water. As it moved into the Middle East, into the lands of sand and dry wind, it should have died. It survived only because of the Arabs. During the Arab agricultural revolution of the 8th century, engineers reshaped the desert. They dug qanats, underground tunnels that carried water from the mountains to the plains, shielding the precious liquid from the sun so it wouldn't evaporate. They built water wheels that lifted water from the rivers.
They planted sugar in Syria, in Egypt, in Cyprus, and eventually in southern Spain. For the first time, sugar reached Europe, but it was not food for the common man. It was a luxury for kings. A pound of sugar in medieval London was worth as much as a comparable weight of gold. It was kept in locked boxes. It was sprinkled sparingly on the food of the ultra-wealthy to demonstrate their power. If you were a peasant in the year 1200, you lived your entire life without ever tasting processed sugar. Your sweetness came from a bruised apple or a dried berry. The white crystal was a myth. But the demand was growing. The kings wanted more. The merchants wanted more. But the Mediterranean was too small. The winters were too cold. The soil was exhausted. Sugar needed a new home. It needed a world with endless rain and endless summer. It was waiting for Christopher Columbus. In 1493, Christopher Columbus prepared for his second voyage to the New World. He loaded his ships with the supplies needed to build a permanent colony. He brought horses, pigs, seeds, and tools. And almost as an afterthought, he brought a bundle of dried woody stalks, sugarcane. He planted the cane on the island of Hispaniola, what we now call the Dominican Republic and Haiti. He wrote in his journal that the cane grew faster than in any other place in the world. The Caribbean was a biological paradise for the plant. The heat was intense, the rain was constant, the soil had never been farmed. The cane stalks grew thick and tall, filled with more juice than anyone had ever seen. But there was a problem that would define the next 400 years of human suffering.
Sugar is labor-intensive. It is perhaps the most difficult crop on earth to harvest by hand. The cane grows in dense, tangled walls. The leaves are sharp as razors, capable of slicing human skin. The fields are full of snakes and insects. And once the cane is cut, a clock starts ticking. It must be crushed and boiled within 24 hours, or the sugar rots inside the stalk. This means that a sugar plantation is not a farm, it is a factory. It requires an army of workers who can work in the blistering heat, hacking at the stalks, hauling tons of material, and standing in front of boiling cauldrons day and night. The Spanish first tried to force the indigenous Taino people to do this work, but the Taino died. They died from European diseases like smallpox. They died from the brutal overwork. Within a few decades, the indigenous population was almost extinct. The fields were ready. The cane was growing. The markets in Europe were screaming for sugar, but there was no one to cut it. And so the eyes of the European powers turned to Africa. This is the moment where sugar ceases to be just a plant and becomes a monster. In the 16th century, the transatlantic slave trade began in earnest, driven almost entirely by the demand for sugar. Ships left the ports of Liverpool, Nantes, and Lisbon. They sailed to the west coast of Africa, trading textiles and guns for human beings. They packed these human beings into the dark, suffocating holds of ships. Those who survived the terrifying journey across the ocean were unloaded in Brazil, Barbados, Jamaica, and Haiti. They were sent into the cane fields. Life on a sugar plantation was a machine designed to extract labor until death. The work was organized into what was called the gang system.
The strongest men and women were in the first gang. Their job was holing, digging square pits in the hard clay soil for planting. Under the tropical sun, with no shade, they stood in lines, raising heavy iron hoes and striking the ground in unison. They worked from sunrise until sunset, and during harvest time the work continued into the night. The processing house, the boiling house, was a vision of hell. Huge copper vats of cane juice boiled violently over open fires. The heat was unbearable. The air was thick with the smell of molasses and smoke. Slaves had to ladle the boiling liquid from one vat to the next. It was dangerous work. If a tired worker slipped, they could fall into the boiling vat. If a hand was caught in the crushing rollers of the mill, an axe was kept nearby to amputate the arm before the machine pulled the whole body in. The life expectancy of a slave on a Caribbean sugar plantation was 7 years. Think about that number, 7 years. It was cheaper for the plantation owners to work a human being to death and buy a new one from Africa than it was to treat them well enough to survive. Sugar was more valuable than human life. By the 18th century, sugar was the oil of its day. It was the most valuable commodity in global trade. It funded the construction of great cities in Europe. It paid for the navies of Britain and France. It created a class of sugar barons who lived in palaces while millions of Africans died in the mud of the Caribbean. The white crystal on the tea tables of London and Boston was soaked in invisible blood. The year is 1806. The setting shifts from the tropical heat to the freezing winter of Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France, is the master of the European continent. His armies have marched across land, conquering nations, but he does not control the sea. The British Royal Navy rules the oceans, and they have established a blockade. A wall of wooden ships surrounds Europe, cutting off all trade. The ships from the Caribbean cannot get through. The coffee stops arriving. The tobacco stops arriving. And, most devastating of all, the sugar stops arriving. Europe goes into withdrawal. For the aristocracy of France and Germany, life without sugar is unbearable. The price of the remaining sugar skyrockets. It becomes a black market item, smuggled in hidden compartments of wagons. People begin to panic. The sweet salt has disappeared. But in a cold laboratory in Berlin, a quiet revolution is taking place. Decades earlier, a German chemist named Andres Marggraf had been looking at a vegetable. It was not a majestic grass like the sugarcane. It was a humble, ugly root, the white beet, Data vulgaris. It grew in the cold dirt of Prussia. It looked like a turnip. It was dirty, lumpy, and cheap. It was food for cattle. But Marggraf had sliced the beet open, dried it, and treated it with alcohol. He placed the liquid under the microscope and saw something familiar: crystals. He realized that the sucrose inside the lowly beet was chemically identical to the sucrose in the tropical cane. The same energy, hidden in a different package. Now, under the pressure of the blockade, the French government turns to science. Napoleon orders the planting of thousands of acres of sugar beets. He builds factories, not in the colonies, but right there in the fields of France. This is a massive shift in history. For the first time, sugar does not depend on the tropics. It does not depend on the trade winds. It becomes a product of chemistry and engineering. Imagine the inside of one of these early beet factories. It is a place of steam and iron. The beets are pulled from the cold mud. They are washed in rotating drums, the sound of roots tumbling against metal, echoing through the hall. They are sliced into thin strips called cosettes, which look like white noodles. These strips are soaked in hot water to diffuse the sugar. The liquid is treated with lime to remove impurities. The smell is different here. It does not smell of molasses and sea air. It smells of cooked vegetables, sulfur, and coal smoke. By the time Napoleon is defeated at Waterloo, the secret is out. You do not need slaves in the Caribbean to make sugar. You can make it in the cloudy fields of Germany, Russia, and Michigan.
The monopoly of the tropics is broken. As the 19th century progresses, the Industrial Revolution takes hold. The world is becoming faster, louder, and more mechanical. And sugar is the fuel for this new world. The old method of making sugar, the open copper vats boiling over wood fires, is too slow. It is too dangerous. It wastes too much energy. The engineers arrive. They replace the wind and the oxen with the steam engine. Now, in the refineries of London and New York, massive pistons drive the crushing rollers. The noise is deafening. The floor shakes with the rhythm of the engines. Chug, chug, chug. But the biggest problem was always the heat. When you boil sugar juice to evaporate the water, you risk burning it. If the temperature gets too high, the sugar caramelizes. It turns dark and bitter. The refiners wanted it white, pure white. Enter a man named Norbert Rillieux. Rillieux was an African-American inventor, a free man of color from New Orleans. He understood the physics of heat. He knew that water boils at a lower temperature in a vacuum. He designed a machine called the multiple effect vacuum pan. It was a series of closed metal vessels. The air was sucked out of them, creating a vacuum. Inside these silent, airless chambers, the sugar juice boiled violently, but at a temperature so low you could touch the outside of the tank without burning your hand. It was safe. It was efficient. It produced sugar crystals of perfect uniformity. But to make it truly white, to remove the last traces of the brown molasses, the refiners used something else, something dark. They took the bones of cattle, thousands of tons of bones from slaughterhouses. They burned these bones in oxygen-free ovens until they turned into charred black granules. They filled massive iron columns 30 feet high with this burnt charred bone charcoal. Then they poured the liquid sugar into the top. As the brown liquid filtered down through the feet of charred bones, the carbon absorbed the color. It absorbed the impurities. What dripped out of the bottom was a liquid as clear as water. It is a strange irony. To create the purest, whitest substance on earth, the industry needed the charred remains of death. Finally, the liquid went to the centrifuge. Imagine a perforated metal basket spinning at 1,000 revolutions per minute. The wet sugar mixture is dumped inside. The centrifugal force, gravity multiplied by speed, slams the mixture against the walls. The liquid molasses is forced out through the holes, but the crystals are trapped inside. The machine spins. It whines like a jet engine, and in seconds the brown sludge is gone. The machine stops.
The operator reaches in and scoops out the result. Snow. Dry, sparkling, white snow. By 1850, the price of sugar crashes. It is no longer the spice of kings. It is no longer kept in locked boxes. It is everywhere. The factories of the Industrial Revolution are hungry for labor. Men, women, and children work 14-hour shifts in the textile mills of Manchester and the steel plants of Pittsburgh. They are tired, they are cold, they are underfed. They need energy, cheap, fast energy. Sugar becomes the fuel of the working class. A cup of hot tea filled with 3 spoons of sugar becomes a meal. A slice of white bread spread with sugary jam becomes lunch. It is the cheapest way to get calories into a human body. It gives a quick burst of energy, a sugar rush, that allows the worker to stand at the loom for another 2 hours. The diet of the human species begins to change. For thousands of years we ate fiber, fat, and protein. We ate things that took a long time to digest. Now we are eating pure, refined energy. New industries rise up to deliver this sugar. The candy industry is born. The soda industry is born. In Atlanta, a pharmacist invents a syrup made of sugar, caffeine, and coca leaves. He calls it Coca-Cola. It is sold as a tonic for brain fatigue. Chocolate, which was once a bitter, spicy drink of the Aztecs, is mixed with milk and massive amounts of sugar to become a solid bar. By the year 1900, the average person in Britain is consuming nearly 100 pounds of sugar a year. The human body, which evolved in the scarcity of the African savanna, is now swimming in a sea of glucose. Our biology is confused. Our pancreas is overworked. We are fueling the machine of industry, but we are beginning to break the machine of the body. The stage is set for the final chapter, the silent crisis.
While the steam engines roared and the factories pumped out white crystals by the ton, a silent crisis was beginning to unfold inside the human body. It is a crisis that was actually known to the ancients, though they did not understand it. Let us travel back for a moment to ancient India, 1500 BC. A physician is sitting by a patient. He observes a strange phenomenon. When the patient urinates on the ground, the ants do not walk away. They swarm toward the liquid. They gather around it as if it were spilled fruit juice. The physician tastes the urine. It is sweet. They called it madhu meha, honey urine. In ancient Greece, the physician Apollonius watched his patients waste away. No matter how much they ate, they grew thinner. They were constantly thirsty, drinking jug after jug of water, yet their bodies seemed to melt away into liquid. He called the condition diabetes, a Greek word meaning to pass through or siphon. Later, the British added the Latin word mellitus, meaning honey sweet. For thousands of years, this was a death sentence. It was a rare, mysterious affliction that struck without warning. The body simply lost the ability to use fuel. The patient starved to death, even while eating. But for most of human history, it was rare. It was an anomaly. Then came the 20th century. Then came the flood of cheap sugar.
To understand what happened, we must look deep inside the abdomen, behind the stomach. There sits a pale, yellowish organ, about 6 inches long. It is soft and unassuming. It does not beat like the heart. It does not inflate like the lungs. It works in total silence. It is the pancreas. In 1869, a German medical student named Paul Langerhans was looking at the pancreas under a microscope. He saw something beautiful. Scattered across the tissue like tiny archipelagos in an ocean were clusters of distinct cells. They looked like little islands floating in the sea of the organ. They were named the islets of Langerhans. These islands are the guardians of our blood. They sense the sugar. When you eat a piece of bread or an apple or a spoonful of sugar, your digestion breaks it down into glucose. The glucose enters your bloodstream. It is fuel. But the cells of your body are locked. They cannot open their doors to let the fuel in on their own. They need a key. The islets of Langerhans produce that key. It is a hormone called insulin. Imagine a vast hallway of billions of doors, your cells. The glucose is piling up in the hallway, knocking to get in. The pancreas releases insulin. The insulin travels to the doors, inserts the key, and turns the lock. The doors open. The glucose rushes in. The energy is used. The hallway is clear. It is a perfect, elegant system. It evolved over millions of years to handle small amounts of sweetness, a berry here, a root there, but it was not designed for the modern world. In the modern world, the hallway is never clear. We wake up and drink orange juice, liquid sugar. We eat cereal, processed starch. We drink coffee with syrup. We eat a burger on a bun made of white flour. We drink a soda. We eat ice cream. The glucose is not just a trickle, it is a flood. It is a tsunami. The pancreas, that quiet, hard-working organ, begins to panic. It sees the massive amount of sugar in the blood, which is toxic if it stays there too long. So it pumps out insulin. It works overtime. It floods the body with keys, trying to open every door as fast as possible. Open, open, open. For years the system holds. The pancreas works harder and harder, but the cells of the body begin to get tired. They are being bombarded with insulin. The locks begin to rust. The keys start to jam. This is called insulin resistance. The cells stop listening. They say, "Enough." They refuse to open the door. Now you have a disaster. The glucose is trapped in the blood. The blood becomes thick and syrupy. It becomes corrosive. It begins to damage the delicate lining of the blood vessels. It scratches the inside of the arteries. Meanwhile, the pancreas doesn't know why the sugar isn't leaving. It thinks it hasn't produced enough keys, so it screams. It pushes itself to the brink of exhaustion, pumping out more and more. Before we understood this mechanism, the only way to treat the sweet sickness was starvation. Doctors would put children on diets of nothing but lettuce and boiled vegetables, hoping to extend their lives by a few months. But in 1921, in a cold laboratory in Toronto, Canada, hope arrived. A surgeon named Frederick Banting and a student named Charles Best were working with dogs. It was messy, difficult work. They were trying to extract the mysterious secretion from the pancreas. It was a freezing winter. The laboratory smelled of antiseptic and animals. They managed to isolate a muddy, thick liquid from the pancreas of a healthy dog. They injected it into a dog that was dying of diabetes. The dog, which had been unable to lift its head, woke up. It walked. Its blood sugar dropped. They purified the liquid. They called it insulin. In 1922, they went to a hospital ward filled with dying children. These children were in diabetic comas, skeletal and pale, their parents waiting by their bedsides for the end. Banting and Best went from bed to bed, injecting the new serum. By the time they reached the last child at the end of the room, the first child at the beginning of the room began to wake up. One by one, the children opened their eyes. It was described as a biblical miracle, a resurrection. Insulin was a triumph of science. It turned a death sentence into a manageable condition. But it also allowed us to ignore the root cause. We found a way to manage the sugar, so we kept eating it. We built a safety net, so we continued to jump off the cliff. And so the consumption grew, and the factories kept churning. After the discovery of insulin, the fear of sugar faded. Science had provided a safety net, and so the food industry began to experiment. In the 1950s and 60s, a new kind of science emerged. It was not the science of medicine, it was the science of the mouth. Food engineers began to study the human tongue with the precision of cartographers mapping a new continent. They discovered that the human brain has a specific break point for sweetness. If you eat a spoonful of pure sugar, it is too sweet. Your brain sends a signal. Stop. This is too much. But if you mix that sugar with the right amount of fat and the right amount of salt, the signal disappears. The stop button in the brain is disabled. You can keep eating, and you will never feel full. You will only crave more. They called this mathematical perfection the bliss point. Laboratories were built to find this number. Taste testers sat in white rooms, sipping thousands of variations of soda and tomato sauce. They weren't looking for the best flavor. They were looking for the maximum amount of sugar a human being could tolerate before it became unappealing. Once they found it, they put it in everything. Go to a modern supermarket. Walk down the aisles. Pick up a jar of spaghetti sauce. Pick up a loaf of whole wheat bread. Pick up a bottle of salad dressing. Read the label. Sugar is there. It is the second or third ingredient. It is not there for flavor. It is there for chemistry. It acts as a preservative. It adds texture. But mostly it is there to hit the bliss point. It is there to ensure that when you finish the jar, your first instinct is to go back and buy another one. We stopped eating food. We started eating equations. In the 1970s, the story of sugar took one final dramatic turn, and strangely, it brings us back to a grass. But this time, it was not the cane of New Guinea, it was the corn of Iowa. Food prices were rising. The government wanted cheap calories for the population. Scientists in Japan and America discovered a way to use enzymes to break down the starch in corn and turn it into a syrup. It was a miracle for the industry. It was sweeter than sugar. It was liquid, so it was easy to pump into tanker trucks. And most importantly, because of government subsidies for corn, it was incredibly cheap. The cane fields of the Caribbean were replaced by the endless cornfields of the Midwest. The crystal became a syrup. Suddenly, the cost of sweetness dropped to almost zero. Sodas became larger. Big gulps appeared. The standard bottle size went from 6 ounces to 20 ounces. Movie theater popcorn buckets became the size of trash cans filled with sugar-coated carbohydrates. The human body, still running on the biology of a hunter-gatherer from the Stone Age, was now being fueled by a high-octane industrial sludge. The liver, overwhelmed by the fructose, began to turn the sugar directly into fat. Not the fat under your skin, but the visceral fat that wraps around your organs. The fatty liver, a condition once seen only for alcoholics, began to appear in children. The timeline of the grass was complete. It had conquered the marsh, the ocean, the plantation, and finally, the cell.
It is beautiful in its own way. It is a masterpiece of nature, stored sunlight, captured by a plant, purified by fire, and crystallized by time. But it is a heavy thing to hold. If you hold a grain of sugar up to the light, you can see the history trapped inside. You can see the canoes of the Pacific Islanders paddling across the blue ocean. You can see the stone wheels of ancient India grinding slowly in the dust. You can see the great aqueducts of the Arabs bringing water to the desert. You can see the dark hull of the slave ship crossing the Atlantic. You can see the back of the worker bent over the hoe in Haiti. You can see the steam rising from the factories of the Industrial Revolution. And you can see the quiet, sterile rooms of the modern hospital, where the legacy of this history is treated one patient at a time. From a rare spice fit for kings to a commodity that is cheaper than dirt, from a medicine to a poison, the grass from New Guinea succeeded beyond its wildest dreams. It did what every species wants to do. It spread. It covered the earth. It made itself essential. It made us love it. And in exchange, it asked for everything. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, let the history fade. The factories are silent now. The ships are docked. The machines have stopped spinning. There is only the quiet rhythm of your breath. The story is over. The rest is silence. Good night. Thank you for listening to this episode of History for Sleep. If the rhythm of this story helped you relax, and if you would like to hear more long-form documentaries about the slow, detailed history of the world, please consider subscribing to the channel.
we have many more stories to tell, stories of salt, of iron, of glass, and of the sea. Sleep well,